The morning began like every other morning inside the Lancaster estate, quiet, polished, predictable. The helpers moved through the marble halls with practiced silence, each step measured, each breath careful, as if the walls themselves could fire them for making a sound too loud. And then came Aurora Lancaster, the billionaire heiress whose presence felt like winter sunlight, bright, distant, untouchable. Everyone straightened the moment she appeared. Everyone except one man, Evan Cole, the single dad who worked as a cleaner, stayed crouched on the floor, wiping a spill left behind by someone who would never bother to thank him. He didn't even look up when her heels clicked closer. Why would he? People like her never noticed people like him. But Aurora stopped. For the first time in years, she truly stopped. And as Evan raised his head in confusion, she leaned down, close enough for him to feel her breath against his cheek. Then, softly, almost reverently, she kissed him. A single kiss that shouldn't have meant anything. But it shattered the stillness of the estate, silenced every whisper, and unlocked a memory she had buried for 14 long years. A memory of a forest, of fear, of a boy who saved her life, and of a promise destiny had finally come to collect. Evan didn't hear the gasp at first. He only felt the room freeze around him, like the air had turned to glass. One second he was on his knees, holding a damp cloth in a metal bucket, the faint smell of detergent clinging to his hands. The next, his cheek was tingling where Aurora's lips had touched, and every pair of eyes in the grand entrance hall was pinned to him, like he'd just committed a crime instead of standing perfectly still. Someone dropped a silver tray in the distance, the clatter ricocheting off the marble, but no one even turned to look. The other helpers stared with a strange mix of horror and fascination, as if they'd just seen a wild animal sit down at the dinner table. Evan's heart hammered in his chest, loud and uneven, far too big for the thin, faded work shirt stretching over his shoulders. Aurora stepped back as if nothing unusual had happened, her expression composed, her chin lifted the way it always was when she moved through the house, like she owned not just the property, but the sky pressing down above it. "Good morning," she said simply, her eyes lingering on his just a moment longer than was appropriate before she turned away, the soft click of her heels resuming their rhythm on the polished floor. The spell broke. Whispers followed in her wake like a second shadow. Evan swallowed hard and forced his gaze back down to the cloth in his hand, scrubbing the same spotless patch of floor until his fingers ached. He knew better than to ask why. People like him didn't get explanations. They barely got eye contact. "What was that?" hissed Mara, one of the housemaids, as she hurried past him with a stack of freshly pressed linens. Her tone was sharp with suspicion, laced with the sourness of envy. "What did you do?" "Nothing," Evan murmured, not trusting his voice to carry more than a whisper. He stood slowly, his knees protesting, the weight of the bucket dragging on his arm. "It was nothing." "The heiress doesn't just go around kissing the help," another helper muttered under his breath, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Especially not him." Evan pretended not to hear, but the words lodged under his skin anyway. He felt like every move he made suddenly had a spotlight on it. The hall, usually just another space to be cleaned and polished, had become a stage, and he was the unfortunate actor shoved out in front of an audience without a script. When his shift finally ended, the weight of the day pressed so heavily on his shoulders that even the walk down the long driveway felt different. The Lancaster estate rose up behind him, all sharp lines and mirrored windows, reflecting the evening sky like a giant watching him leave. He kept his head down, hands tucked into his worn jacket, ignoring the faint tremor in his fingers. By the time he reached the bus stop, the ridiculousness of it all had finally sunk in. A billionaire heiress had kissed him. On the cheek, yes, and barely more than a brush of skin, but still, a kiss. He huffed out a humorless breath, half laugh, half disbelief, and shook his head as if he could dislodge the memory. Maybe she'd tripped, maybe she'd lost her balance, maybe he was going insane. The bus ride home was long and quiet, filled with the familiar rattle of loose windows and the soft murmur of strangers' lives. Evan stared out at the city passing by in streaks of gray and rust, letting his brain drift to safer ground. He pictured Lily waiting at the window, her small face pressed against the glass, her hands leaving smudged prints he never had the heart to wipe away. The thought steadied him the way nothing else ever did. When he finally opened the front door, the sharp scent of instant noodles and cheap detergent wrapped around him like a familiar blanket. Lily barreled into him at full speed, her dark hair a mess, her socks mismatched. "Daddy!" she chirped, her voice just a little louder than usual, shaped and softened by the hearing aids tucked behind her ears. He scooped her up with a groan, pretending she was far heavier than her small frame could ever be. "You're getting too big," he teased, spinning her once. "You're going to have to start carrying me home from work soon." Lily giggled, the sound bright, and tapped his cheek with her small hand as if reclaiming him from whatever world he'd been in all day. For a moment, the memory of another hand on his face, soft and impossibly out of place, flickered through his mind, but he pushed it away. This was what mattered. Sticky fingers, tired bones, and a little girl who believed he could fix anything as long as he was there. After dinner, when Lily had finally settled in with her favorite picture book, her fingers tracing the drawings more than the words, Evan sat at the small kitchen table with a stack of unpaid bills spread out in front of him. The numbers blurred if he looked at them too long. Hospital consultations, speech therapy, new molds for her hearing aids, the harsh reality of it all pressed down on him. Some days it felt like he was trying to hold back the ocean with his bare hands. He rubbed his temples and exhaled slowly, the phantom warmth of Aurora's lips brushing his cheek creeping back into his awareness like an unwelcome ghost. Why had she done it? Was it some kind of cruel joke? A test? A moment of boredom in a life too big for ordinary feelings? He knew enough about the wealthy to understand that sometimes they treated people like him as props, background details in their personal movies. But something about the way she had looked at him, it hadn't felt like mockery. It had felt like recognition. 3 miles away, in a room with ceilings high enough to swallow his whole house twice over, Aurora Lancaster sat on the edge of her bed, elbows resting on her knees, staring at the faint imprint of her fingertips on her lips. She replayed the morning over and over, the way his breath had caught, the flash of confusion in his eyes, the way every sound in the hall had cut off as if the world itself were holding its breath. She hadn't planned it. Aurora never did anything without planning, without calculating consequences, without considering how a single movement might ripple out through the fragile web of power and reputation that held her life together. But the moment she saw the curve of his shoulder as he leaned forward, the fabric of his shirt stretching just enough to reveal that thin, jagged line of scar across his skin, the world had tilted. She had been 14 the last time she saw that scar. 14, in a forest that smelled like wet earth and panic, with branches clawing at her arms and the sky disappearing behind a canopy of leaves. She could still feel the damp chill of that night in her bones sometimes, usually when she was alone and the mask she wore for everyone else lay discarded on the bathroom counter. She'd been lost, barefoot, breathless, and terrified, her ankle throbbing with every step. She remembered tripping over a root, the sharp bite of pain in her palms as she hit the ground, and the humiliating sob that escaped her throat before she could swallow it back. It was then that she'd heard it. A voice, uncertain but kind. "Are you okay?" Turning, she'd seen a boy no older than 15, with dirt smudged on his cheek and worry etched into his brow. He'd helped her up, brushed the mud from her clothes with clumsy hands, and lit a fire with such determination it was as if he could fight back the entire night just by striking sparks. He'd wrapped his worn jacket around her shoulders, ignoring his own shivers, and kept her talking until her tears slowed enough for her to breathe. When she'd asked his name, he'd only shrugged and said, "It doesn't matter, you'll be out of here soon." But it had mattered. It had mattered so much that she'd spent years chasing the memory like a ghost. And the boy she'd met in that forest had a scar just like the one she'd seen on Evan's shoulder. Aurora tilted her head back and stared at the ornate ceiling, feeling like she was at the edge of something she didn't know how to name. For 14 years, she had carried that night hidden inside her like a secret talisman. Whenever the world felt too cold, too sharp, she'd close her eyes and remember the warmth of a stranger's jacket and the sound of a boy insisting he would stay awake so she could sleep. She'd promised herself that if she ever found him, she would thank him properly. She hadn't imagined the boy would be working in her house with a mop and bucket, eyes hollowed by exhaustion and responsibility. The intercom crackled, dragging her back to the present. "Miss Lancaster," came the familiar voice of her Uncle Henry, one of the board members and the man who'd shaped most of her public image. "We need to finalize your schedule for next week. Elliot is expecting—" "I'm busy," Aurora cut in, her voice smooth, practiced hiding the storm beneath. "We'll talk tomorrow." "You've been avoiding him," Henry warned. "The engagement dinner has already been whispered about. You don't want to appear unstable." Unstable. The word always came when she didn't behave exactly the way they wanted. Aurora felt her jaw tighten. "Good night, Uncle," she said calmly, then disconnected. She crossed to her desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out an old, worn matchbox. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of faded fabric, was a tiny carved wooden charm, a small bird, barely the length of her thumb. The boy from the forest had given it to her right before the search party found them. "For courage," he'd said, "in case you get lost again." Her fingers tightened around it now. She knew Evan might not even remember her. The forest had been one night in a world of other problems for him, she was sure. But for her, it had been everything. And this morning, seeing that scar, feeling something in her chest crack open, she had made a choice she had never allowed herself to make before. She'd acted on instinct, not expectation. She'd kissed him. The house staff would talk. Her family would question. Elliot would demand answers. Let them, she thought. For the first time in years, Aurora felt like she had found something real in a life built out of polished surfaces and empty deals. The next morning, while the estate still yawned awake in the pale light of dawn, Aurora stood by her office window, watching the helpers arrive one by one. Her gaze searched the driveway, pulse ticking up an almost imperceptible notch when she saw him. Evan walked with his head down, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if he'd grown used to making himself smaller so the world wouldn't notice him. But she noticed. She couldn't not notice anymore. She picked up the phone on her desk and dialed the internal line. "Good morning," came the nervous voice of the house manager, already on edge from yesterday's rumors. "This is Aurora," she said. "Effective immediately, I want Evan Cole reassigned from cleaning staff to my personal team." There was a stunned silence on the other end, followed by a stuttered, "Your personal team, Miss Lancaster?" "Yes," she replied, her gaze still fixed on the figure crossing the courtyard below. "He'll be my assistant. Have him report to my office after his shift starts." She hung up before the manager could protest. Downstairs, as Evan was pulling on his gloves and mentally preparing for another long day of being invisible, the house manager appeared with a look that suggested the world had officially turned upside down. "Cole," he said, voice tight, "the heiress wants to see you." Evan straightened slowly, the echo of yesterday's kiss burning like a brand on his skin. "Now?" "Now," the manager confirmed. "And try not to look like you're about to pass out. You're being moved." "Moved?" Evan repeated, his heart kicking hard against his ribs. "To what?" The manager's lips twisted behind his forced professionalism. "To her." Evan followed the house manager through corridors he had only ever cleaned but never truly walked with intention, his heartbeat uneven as if trying to warn him that he was crossing a line that had been drawn for men like him long before he was born. The mansion seemed different today, larger somehow, colder in some corners, brighter in others, its marble floors echoing the sound of his boots like accusations. By the time they reached the private wing where Aurora worked, Evan's palms were damp inside his gloves and his throat felt tight, as though every step toward her office was another step away from the life he had carefully built, a life made of quiet routines and predictable struggles. The manager knocked lightly before opening the door and ushering him inside. "Mr. Cole is here, Miss Lancaster." Aurora stood near the window, sunlight glinting off the sleek surface of her desk and catching in her hair like a halo of gold. She didn't look away from the view immediately. Instead, she finished the breath she was taking, as if steadying herself for something monumental, then turned toward him with a calmness that didn't match the tension radiating through the room. "Evan?" she said softly. His name in her voice felt strange, like hearing a familiar tune played in a different key. He swallowed. "Miss Lancaster, you wanted to see me?" She nodded and gestured for the manager to leave them. The door clicked shut, sealing them in what suddenly felt like a world far removed from the noisy bustle of the estate. "Please sit," she said, motioning to the chair across from her desk. He obeyed, awkward but obedient, his eyes tracing the gleaming edges of the room, the expensive artwork, the perfectly arranged bookshelves, everything so deliberately curated, unlike the chaotic patchwork of his own life. Aurora took a slow breath, folding her hands together. "I'm reassigning you to my personal team," she said. "You'll assist me directly." Evan blinked. For a moment he thought he had misheard her, that maybe some part of his mind was still stuck on the memory of the kiss and imagining scenarios that didn't make sense. "Ma'am, I don't think I understand." "It's simple," she replied. "You'll work with me from now on. Fewer cleaning duties, more administrative ones." "Administrative," he repeated, as if the word itself were too heavy to hold. "But I'm not qualified for that. I clean floors and fix things when they break. I don't—" "You're more capable than you think," she interrupted gently. "And I'm not asking. I'm telling you what your new role will be." Her tone was calm but firm, the tone of a woman used to making decisions that became reality simply because she willed them to. "Why me?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. There were so many people in that estate more experienced, better dressed, more confident, more appropriate. Aurora didn't answer at first. Her gaze softened slightly, though the rest of her expression remained composed. "Because I trust you," she said finally. The words hit him harder than he expected. No one trusted him with anything except chores and late invoices. No one except Lily, and her trust came from innocence, not choice. "I don't understand," he said again, but the confusion wasn't defensive now. It was vulnerable, raw. "You barely know me." "That's not exactly true," she murmured, lowering her eyes for a moment before meeting his again. Something flickered there, recognition, longing, fear, and something else he couldn't name, something that made him feel warm and unsettled all at once. She turned toward her desk and slid a small wooden box toward him. "Open it." His fingers trembled as he lifted the lid. Inside, nestled between folds of pale fabric, was a wooden carving, a small bird worn smooth from years of being held. Evan froze. His breath caught, his vision narrowing on the tiny object that had once been in his hands, in his pocket, then offered to a frightened girl in the darkness of a forest 14 years ago. "Where did you get this?" His voice cracked. Aurora's lips curved into something too soft to be called a smile and too sad to be called joy. "You gave it to me," she said. "When I was lost. When you found me." The memory slammed into him so abruptly he felt dizzy. The girl trembling in the cold. The way she clung to him as though he were the only solid thing in a world that had collapsed. The night they huddled near the fire he had built, her tears drying on his jacket. He remembered the bird. He remembered giving it to her and saying words he barely understood at the time. "For courage, in case you get lost again." His throat tightened painfully. "You're her?" Aurora nodded. "I've been looking for you ever since." Evan had no words. His chest felt too small for his heart, too fragile for the enormity of what she had just revealed. A part of him had buried that night deep beneath years of hardship and exhaustion. He had never expected it to matter again, never expected the girl he saved to become the woman in front of him, standing in a mansion while he wore a uniform that didn't fit quite right. She stepped closer, almost hesitantly, as though afraid he might disappear if she moved too fast. "When I saw your scar yesterday, I knew." He dropped his gaze. Suddenly, the kiss made sense. Suddenly, everything was too much. "Miss Lancaster, Aurora, I'm not someone who belongs in your world." She inhaled sharply, as if his words had cut deeper than intended. "Evan, this isn't about worlds. It's about truth, and about gratitude I've carried alone for 14 years. I didn't save you to be owed anything," he whispered. "I know," she replied softly. "That's exactly why I owe you everything." The silence that followed was thick, trembling with emotions he couldn't touch without breaking. She returned to her chair and composed herself. "As my assistant, you'll accompany me to meetings, organize my schedule, help with documents, and—" "Aurora," he interrupted gently. Her eyes lifted. "I can't accept this." Pain flickered across her face, quickly hidden behind her usual poise. "Why not?" He gestured helplessly. "Because I don't fit. I don't belong. I'm just a cleaner. A father trying to make ends meet. I don't know how to stand beside someone like you without looking like a mistake." "Evan," she said quietly, "being beside me wouldn't be a mistake. It would be the first thing in a long time that felt right." Before he could respond, the door opened abruptly. Elliot Grant strode in, his expression carved from irritation and entitlement. He didn't even acknowledge Evan at first. His attention was fixed entirely on Aurora. "We need to discuss the charity event." He stopped when he finally noticed Evan, his eyes narrowing with disdain so sharp it felt like a blade drawn across the room. "Why is the cleaning staff in your office?" he demanded. Aurora didn't flinch. "He's not cleaning staff anymore. He's my assistant." Elliot's eyebrows flew up. Then he laughed. "Is this a joke?" "No." "Have you lost your mind?" Aurora stood, her posture elegant and unbending. "Sit down, Elliot. This conversation isn't about you." Elliot's jaw tightened. "Everything concerning you is about me, especially with the engagement dinner coming up." Evan stiffened, confusion twisting into something sharper. "Engagement?" Aurora's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker, resentment, defiance, perhaps even fear, before she masked it. "There is no engagement," she said coldly. "Nor will there be one." Elliot laughed without humor. "Your family disagrees." "They don't control my life. They control your image," he shot back, "and your inheritance, and the board's opinion. Do you really think you can parade around with—" he waved dismissively at Evan, "this without consequences?" Evan felt heat crawl up his neck. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but Aurora beat him to it. She stepped forward, placing herself directly between the two men. "Evan saved my life once," she said, voice steady, "and has done more for me with a single act of kindness than you have in all the years you've known me." The room fell silent. Elliot's eyes hardened. "You're going to regret this," he said slowly. Aurora didn't blink. "Not as much as I'd regret allowing someone like you to make decisions for me." Elliot stormed out, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. The quiet that followed was heavy and trembling. Evan stared at the floor, unsure whether he should apologize, leave, or collapse from the pressure building in his chest. Aurora exhaled shakily. "I'm sorry you had to witness that," she said. "My family has expectations, ones I refuse to meet." Evan spoke softly. "You shouldn't have to fight everyone because of me." She stepped toward him, her voice gentle but unyielding. "Evan, this isn't just about you. It's about me choosing who I trust, who I want near me, and I want you." He felt as though the world had tilted again, just slightly, but enough to make his breath stutter. "What about my daughter?" he asked, the one question that mattered. "Lily is part of me. Any decision I make, she's always first." Aurora's eyes softened, truly softened. "I know," she whispered, "and I want to know her too." His heart clenched painfully. She didn't know what she was saying. She didn't understand the responsibility, the fragility of a child's trust, but the hope in her eyes was undeniable. "Give me a chance to prove," Aurora added quietly, "that I can be someone safe for both of you." Evan looked away, overwhelmed by fear and longing intertwining until he couldn't tell one from the other. He didn't know how to be part of her world. He didn't know if he could survive stepping into it. But when he looked at her again, standing there with the carved bird between them, the ghost of a forest night lingering in the space they shared, he realized something terrifying. She had already stepped into his, and there was no undoing that now. The following days unfolded like a storm gathering strength behind the walls of the Lancaster estate, silent at first, then steadily darker, sharper, until every corner hummed with tension. Evan stepped into his new position with the hesitance of a man walking across a frozen lake, unsure which step might send him plunging through. He followed Aurora to meetings, took notes, answered calls, and tried desperately not to look like someone who belonged more with a mop than with million-dollar contracts and polished executives. Yet Aurora never faltered. She walked beside him with quiet intention, her presence shielding him from the worst of the whispers. And there were whispers, everywhere. They slipped through corridors like smoke curling into offices, kitchens, staff rooms. Why him? What spell did he put on her? He's using her, obviously. A man like that doesn't climb unless he's stepping on someone richer. Evan pretended he didn't hear them, but they dug into his skin like thorns. Worse was the way some of the staff, once neutral or indifferent, now watched him with resentment sharp enough to draw blood. He understood jealousy, he understood fear. What he didn't understand was why Aurora insisted on keeping him so close when it was clear the entire estate would eventually turn against him for it. Aurora, meanwhile, was fighting battles he couldn't see. The board questioned her judgment. Her Uncle Henry scheduled meetings she refused to attend. Elliot sent her message after message, each more controlling than the last. And still, she walked into every room with Evan by her side, as if daring the world to challenge her choice. One afternoon, as they left a tense strategy meeting, Evan caught her leaning against the elevator wall, her shoulders slumping for the first time all day. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. She opened her eyes, and the weariness in them startled him. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice didn't match the words. "I just need a moment." He hesitated before offering her a bottle of water. She looked at it as though surprised anyone would think to care for her. Taking it, she said softly, "Thank you, Evan." It was a simple phrase, but the sincerity in her tone felt like she was thanking him for something far larger than water. For a moment, in that small metal box rising between floors, with the hum of machinery around them and nothing else intruding, they stood in a peace that felt fragile and precious. Evan's heart twisted. He wasn't sure how close he was allowed to stand. He wasn't sure what lines he was allowed to cross. But he also wasn't sure if those lines even existed anymore. Then the elevator doors opened, revealing Elliot standing in the hall. His expression darkened instantly. "Of course," he drawled, his gaze flicking between Aurora and Evan with simmering contempt. "Babysitting your pet project again?" Aurora stepped out without missing a beat. "If you're referring to my assistant, yes." "Assistant," Elliot repeated, sneering. "That's what we're calling it now?" Evan bristled but stayed silent. He had learned long ago that responding to men like Elliot only fed their hunger for dominance. Elliot moved closer, his voice dropping. "You're embarrassing yourself, Aurora. You're embarrassing your family." "My family embarrasses itself," she replied coldly. "I'm simply refusing to join them." Elliot's smile vanished. "There will be consequences." "I'm aware," she said. Evan couldn't see her face from behind, but he saw the way her shoulders lifted, squared, sharpened. She stepped forward, brushing past Elliot without another word, leaving him staring after her like a predator denied a hunt. As soon as they turned the corner, Evan let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "You shouldn't provoke him," he murmured. "He's dangerous." Aurora's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Evan, I've dealt with dangerous men my entire life. Elliot is only frightening to people who let him be." "And I'm one of those people," he said quietly. "Maybe," she admitted, "but that doesn't mean you have to stay that way." He looked at her then, really looked, and felt that familiar unease, like she could see more of him than he was ready to show. Later that evening, after finishing his shift, Evan returned home to the comforting chaos of Lily's world. She threw herself at him as usual, her laughter echoing through the tiny apartment. They ate dinner together, cheap noodles again, and she proudly showed him a picture she had drawn at school. 3 stick figures holding hands, 2 tall, 1 small. He recognized himself in Lily instantly. The third figure made his breath hitch. "Who's this?" he asked lightly. Lily grinned, tapping the stick figure's head. "Miss Rora," she said happily. Aurora. In Lily's mind, Aurora belonged with them. Evan's stomach twisted. He didn't know whether to feel warmed or terrified. "She's nice," Lily added, as if that settled everything. After putting Lily to bed, Evan sat alone at the kitchen table, head in his hands. What was he doing? What was happening to his life? He had stepped into a world he wasn't built for, a world that could crush him and Lily both without effort. And Aurora was becoming far too important far too quickly. He thought about the forest, about the trembling girl with leaves in her hair and fear in her eyes, about the way she had clung to him because he was the only thing that wasn't terrifying in that moment. He had saved her then. But now she was the one pulling him out of his darkness, offering light he didn't know how to accept. The next morning, Evan arrived at work determined to maintain distance, to draw invisible lines he wouldn't cross. But fate, or perhaps Aurora herself, didn't allow it. She greeted him with a small smile that immediately unraveled his resolve. "I'd like your help preparing some files," she said. "Join me in my office?" He followed her, noticing something new in her movements. Tension, the kind that coils around the spine when someone has received bad news. Once the door closed, Aurora dropped her facade. "The board is pressuring me," she said tightly. "They want me to move forward with the engagement." His blood turned cold. "Engagement?" She nodded, jaw clenched. "With Elliot." Evan felt something inside him crack, a quiet, painful sound. "I thought—" He didn't know how to finish the sentence. "I thought you didn't want that. I thought I meant something. I thought the kiss meant something." Aurora sank into her chair, rubbing her temples. "I won't marry him. But refusing him means war, and the board is using the situation with you as ammunition." "With me? They say I'm being reckless, letting emotions interfere with judgment, that promoting you was a mistake." Evan looked down. Maybe it was. She shot to her feet so suddenly he flinched. "Don't say that." Her voice cracked. "Don't you dare say that." The emotion in her tone stunned him. "Aurora." She took a breath that shook faintly. "Evan, I know you're scared. I know this is overwhelming, but I chose you. I trust you. I don't trust almost anyone." He opened his mouth, but the door burst open again, this time not with Elliot's fury, but with Henry's cold, polished authority. "Aurora," Henry said sharply, "we need to talk, now." She stiffened. "I'm in a meeting. This is more important." His eyes flicked to Evan, dismissive and irritated. "You," Henry said. "Wait outside." Evan looked at Aurora, silently asking if she wanted him to go. She hesitated, but only for a second. "Evan," she said gently, "it's okay." Something in her eyes begged him to trust her. He stood, nodded, and left, the door closing softly behind him. But he didn't walk far. Through the thick wooden panel, he could still hear Henry's voice rising, fueled by the arrogance of a man who had always believed he controlled her life. "You're destroying yourself," Henry snapped. "The engagement will proceed. Elliot brings stability. This janitor brings scandal." "His name is Evan," Aurora said sharply, "and he saved my life." "You were a child," Henry spat, "and foolish. That doesn't mean you let him drag you down now." "He isn't dragging me anywhere. I chose to help him." "Help? Is that what you call this? He's manipulating you." The slap of Aurora's hand against the desk made Evan flinch. "Enough," she said, ice in every syllable. "Do not speak about him that way." Henry lowered his voice, but the venom remained. "If you don't end this, the board will move to question your leadership." "Let them," she growled. "I won't be controlled." A long silence followed. Then Henry spoke with quiet cruelty. "If you keep him near you, you will lose everything." Evan felt those words like a punch to the gut. Lose everything. Because of him, because she wouldn't let him fall through her fingers a second time. The door opened abruptly and Henry left, brushing past Evan without a glance. Aurora stood inside, hands trembling on the edge of her desk, her breath shaky. Evan stepped back into the room, uncertain. She looked up, and the pain in her eyes nearly broke him. "Evan," she whispered, "I need you to stay. Please." He wanted to. God, he wanted to, but Henry's words echoed too loudly. "Aurora, being near me is hurting you." "No," she said instantly. "What hurts me is losing you." His heart clenched. "I don't want to be the reason your world falls apart." "Maybe it needs to fall apart," she whispered, "so I can finally build one that's mine." And that was the moment Evan realized something terrifying and beautiful. Aurora wasn't clinging to him because of the past. She was choosing him now, choosing him despite everything. But before he could answer, the intercom beeped with urgent news, news that would shatter whatever fragile peace they had left. Elliot had done something big, and the war Aurora had been trying to avoid was already coming to their door. The news came with the force of a collapsing world. Elliot had leaked manipulated financial documents to the media, framing Aurora for reckless mismanagement and claiming Evan was the unqualified lover she had illegally elevated into a position of influence. The story spread like wildfire. The Lancaster name dragged across headlines within minutes. Aurora's team panicked. The board demanded an emergency meeting. And through it all, Aurora stood frighteningly still, her anger sharpened into something cold and precise. "He thinks he can destroy us," she murmured, voice trembling not with fear but with resolve. "But he doesn't understand what I'm capable of when I'm done being afraid." Evan wanted to protect her, shield her from the weight of every accusation, but she stepped forward before he could speak. "You saved me once," she whispered. "Let me save myself now." Together, they gathered the evidence Elliot believed he had hidden. Keys Evan unlocked with quiet expertise. Files Aurora pieced together with razor-sharp intelligence. By evening, she stood before the board and laid everything bare. Elliot's fraud, his blackmail, his manipulation. The truth cut through the room like lightning. By nightfall, Elliot was removed, detained, and stripped of every privilege he had once flaunted. When Aurora finally returned home, exhaustion clinging to her like a second skin, Evan waited for her alone in the dimly lit corridor. She stepped into his arms without hesitation, her voice breaking for the first time in days. "It's over," she whispered, "because you were with me." Evan held her tightly, his cheek pressed to her hair, realizing he no longer feared belonging to her world, because they were building a new one together. And when Lily ran toward them, slipping her small hand between theirs, Aurora's smile finally reached her eyes, soft and certain, as if destiny had simply been waiting for all three of them to arrive at the same moment in time.